All right. Hey, good evening. I am Lee Wright, the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston.
And I'm Carrie Lund, the director of the Pursuit of History, and I'm in Virginia. With us tonight is historian and author Stephen Knott. Thanks so much for being with us tonight, Steve.
Well, thank you, Lee. Thank you, Carrie. It's really a privilege to be here. I love the work that you guys do, so I'm looking forward to our discussion tonight.
Well, thanks, Steve. So you've written several books. Why don't you take us through those, and then we'll focus, of course, on your most recent book.
So my first book, Lee, was a look at how early American presidents used covert operations or secret operations, starting with George Washington, both during the American Revolution, and then he incorporated some of those techniques and tactics into the first American presidency. And then I kind of took it up through the Lincoln presidency. So it was a look at presidential use of covert operations, but not the typical CIA Cold War era, but during the early Republic. My next book was on Alexander Hamilton, and it kind of traced Hamilton's shifting reputation in the American mind throughout, his life and then up to our time. And then I wrote a couple of books that grew out of my experience at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where I was involved in an oral history project that looked at the contemporary presidency. So I wrote a couple of books about the Reagan presidency and about George W. Bush. And then this most recent one is kind of a broad overview of the American presidency from George Washington up to the present day.
Well, great. You've spoken at History Camp twice, and one of those, as I recall, was on the covert operations, and that was a really well-attended session. And then the Hamilton session, also very popular. So we're hoping you're going to join us in this coming March 2021, for History Camp Boston.
I'd be thrilled. Again, Lee, I love the work that you and Carrie do. Happy to help in any way I can, and I've always had a terrific experience at History Camp. So I'm looking forward to it, assuming that the pandemic has lifted by then.
Exactly. And we do have some folks who discover us here. They aren't familiar with History Camp. So if folks are interested in more information, go to historycamp.org. All right, so let's jump into the current book, and we're going to go from, say, Washington up to maybe Eisenhower. Is that right?
Sounds good. Yeah.
So why don't we just start with Washington? Tell us kind of what your view was in terms of how kind of the model he created, and then the second, the third, the fourth president, and how that model changed.
So Washington and Alexander Hamilton at his side, I think were both determined to create a presidency that was a dignified office. And they were sort of constantly sending or today we would call them memos, back and forth to each other, trying to figure out where the appropriate line was in this new republic between having the public respect the president, but also allay any fears that the public may have about this elected executive. So they really were determined to convince the American public they had nothing to fear from this presidency, that the president was going to serve as a unifying figure, a unifying head of state, but they were also determined that there might be instances where the president would have to resist popular opinion. And the president does take an oath, of course, to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And for Hamilton and Washington, that was a very important provision. And so you see that, for instance, in their enforcement of the whiskey excise taxes during the Whiskey Rebellion. But again, I think it was a presidency, George Washington's presidency was one that was going to try to act in a dignified manner, in a unifying manner, and avoid as much as possible getting tangled up in partisan disputes. Now that proved to be easier said than done.
Well, it's hard for us to today realize how extraordinary it was to have a president, not a king. Who was the closest kind of world leader, historical figure of roughly that era that Washington and Hamilton might have been considering as something of a model? Was there one?
That's a terrific question, Lee. I mean, in Hamilton's case, he loved reading Plutarch's Lives. And they, of course, were, particularly Hamilton, was aware of the fate of the Roman Republic and the constant threats, not just from without, but from within, that threatened to topple that republic. And of course, it's no accident that in the Federalist Papers, Hamilton settles on the name of Publius as the pen name. Publius, I believe, being the last Republican leader of the Roman Republic. I think I've got that right. So they were both, particularly Hamilton more than Washington, well versed in history, and their reading of the history of republics was that this was not a sure thing. And again, that's why they invested, I think, so much time in trying to walk that line between generating respect from the public, but also convincing the public that they had nothing to fear from this elected executive. They also spent some time looking at the experience of various governors in the United States, both under British colonial rule and then during that brief period under the Articles of Confederation. They were impressed by, for instance, the powers given to the governor of New York, less impressed with the powers given to the governor of North Carolina, who was required to run for re-election every year and who had very, very limited powers. So they had a few examples to look at, but I have to say, not many.
It's, again, hard for us today to realize what an extraordinary experiment, what an extraordinary enterprise this whole thing was, right? First, to defeat the world's most formidable military force, and then to, over time, knit together a nation. I think of the soldiers at Valley Forge, each with their uniforms from each of the states, right? Perceiving themselves as with an identity to that state, not necessarily to the nation, and so forth. Well, take us forward then from Washington. You cited the Whiskey Rebellion as being a tremendous challenge to him, really, and to our early republic. Do you want to talk about any others that Washington faced, and then play us forward from there?
Yeah, I think both President Washington and Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton were both on the same plane when it came to trying to convince their fellow citizens, as Hamilton put it, to think continentally, to move beyond the parochial, to stop thinking of themselves as citizens of New York or citizens of Virginia, and to begin to think of themselves as Americans. I actually think that was priority one, at least during the first term of the Washington presidency. Again, to create this sense of American identity, of American nationalism. And so you even see that in fairly simple things, such as the issuance of a Thanksgiving Day proclamation in 1789. That proclamation, which Washington sort of agonized over, was addressed to the people of the United States of America. And there's a couple of points within that brief proclamation where Washington appeals to the people's sense of nationalism, this newly created identity. And even by issuing such a proclamation, Washington was, entering uncharted territory. That was usually seen to be the province of the state governors or the colonial governors to issue those kinds of proclamations. So that was one small step to move the American public towards feeling a sense of Americanness, if you will. And then, of course, all of Hamilton's economic proposals, which President Washington backed completely. Hamilton gets either the blame or the credit for these proposals, but they were ultimately President Washington's. They were all designed to bind the American public in this to bind it with this new experiment in Republican government.
The Thanksgiving Proclamation is a fascinating example. Are there some others that were either symbolic or perhaps more substantive?
Yeah, believe it or not, President Washington's 3 tours of the United States, both symbolic, but I would say quite substantive in that, again, the president is trying to convince the American people they have nothing to fear from this new office. And so he's being accessible to the public. But he's also traveling to the farthest reaches of New England and deep into the South, sometime for months on end, again, to sort of show the flag, if you will, and to show the people their new president. And on the rare occasions when he would actually speak to these public gatherings, it was nothing about any sort of policy dispute over the Assumption Plan. It was to appeal to their Americanness, to appeal to their patriotism, and to convince them, as I said earlier, to think continentally. So the proclamations, the tours, and then very specific policies, particularly Hamilton's economic proposals, were all designed to create this sense of American identity.
And then Jefferson, let's go there. Talk to us about the change from and the conception of the presidency from, say, Washington to Jefferson.
So Jefferson came to believe that both President Washington and President Adams had acted too much in a sort of monarchical British manner. Jefferson was dismissive of those tours that I just mentioned. Washington would arrive in this gilded carriage with a small military escort drawn by 6 white horses and a few attendants. Jefferson was very much put off by that kind of display of what he considered to be, it was just too British. Jefferson also felt that Washington's annual messages that were delivered in person, today we would call it a State of the Union address, that those were kind of a carryover or a holdover from British rule. So Jefferson called his election of 1800 the Revolution of 1800, and he was determined to simplify the presidency, to strip it of any aristocratic or monarchical inclinations, and also to, if he could, undo a lot of Hamilton's economic proposals, which he believed had given the national government too much power at the expense of the states. So Jefferson is both trying to, I would say, rein in presidential power, but also constrict the power of the federal government. And there's one other thing I should add, Lee. Jefferson believed that in some ways the legitimacy of the American presidency rested on public opinion, or in public opinion, I guess I should say. Whereas Washington and Hamilton generally tended to try to cite the Constitution. Jefferson, in a sense, popularizes the presidency, makes it more rooted in public opinion. And in a way, that's kind of the crux of my book, this slow but steady moving the presidency away from a kind of constitutional understanding of the office and rooting it more in public opinion, or if you will, rooting it in the will of the majority.
So you cited the Thanksgiving proclamation, the visits and so forth from Washington. Are there some examples from Jefferson's presidency where he tried to make kind of the opposite point of, being a more down to earth, not the gilded carriage and so forth presidency?
Yeah, I mean, within, I think, a few weeks of becoming president, he actually sells that coach. He gets rid of the fancy coach. He gets rid of the 6 white horses. There are no tours of the United States during Jefferson's 8 years in office. He stopped doing the State of the Union or the annual messages in person. He simply has the document delivered to Congress and a clerk reads it. He holds, Washington had a tendency to hold these very formal levees, he called them. Once a week, the public and members of Congress could come in and folks would bow to one another. It was very scripted, not a lot of backslapping, to say the least. Jefferson does away with that and has these very informal, relaxed, small dinners for members of Congress or newspaper people or whatever. So there's just a complete doing away with what Jefferson considered to be these British trappings. And I should say, by the way, the British ambassador to Washington was horrified by Jefferson's casual, informal approach to these diplomatic or congressional dinners. There's a description of Jefferson literally opening the door to the executive mansion, the White House, in slippers and sort of beat up pants. And that just horrified the Brits and various Federalists.
Yeah, how interesting. There's a certain irony in a president saying, I want to be much closer to the people, yet not venturing out. He certainly could have left the carriage and the white horses behind, right?
Right.
And certainly today, or in more recent times, we think of president getting out of the Rose Garden, getting out of the White House, right, and going out into the country and having gatherings and speaking directly. Right,
sure.
To the people.
In a way, it was consistent in Jefferson's mind in that the people's representatives, particularly in the House of Representatives, that's where the power was supposed to lie. Okay, so there's all this writing in Jefferson's presidential papers about deferring to the people's house. Now, having said that, it would be a mistake to assume that Jefferson, as a president, was kind of passive and waited for Congress to act. He was constantly manipulating the members of the House, but he was doing it quietly, doing it behind the scenes. So Jefferson's a complex guy. You have to keep kind of peeling back the layers to find where the truth really lies.
Fascinating. So where's the next stop in our kind of presidential tour in thinking about the evolution of the presidency? Where should we go next?
I think probably we should go next to Andrew Jackson, who I think takes Jefferson's conception of the president and the president's legitimacy being lodged in public opinion. Jackson takes that to the max, and it just flat out simply says that the president is the tribune or the voice of the people, and it's his job to implement the will of the people. And in fact, in one of his important presidential messages, Jackson flat out says the majority is to govern, and the president is to act as the voice of the majority. Now, again, keep in mind, this is a complete reversal of Hamilton's conception, and I think Washington's conception, which was that there might be occasions when the president has to resist the will of the majority and has to take care that the laws be faithfully executed, not necessarily implement what the public or the majority wants. Jackson completely turns that on its head and says that the president has this obligation to fulfill the wishes of the majority. So for instance, Jackson, he's opposed to the Electoral College. He believes the president should be elected through straight popular vote. Again, this is all part of this sense or this notion that the majority is to govern. Now, what I mentioned in my book is that this is also an era when, in a sense, the majority does govern. But unfortunately, there's a price to be paid for that. And that price is going to be paid by free blacks in the North and also Native Americans on the frontier, who are subjected to the whims of various state majorities, and to some extent the federal majority, which is determined in the case of Native Americans to push them out of the way, and in the case of free blacks in many of the northern states, to strip them of their rights to vote. So as much as the notion of the majority is to rule may have a certain appeal to our ears, the book is kind of a warning about the tyranny of the majority and the fact that a lot of minorities paid the price for this concept that the majority is to govern at all times.
Fascinating. Should we next go to Lincoln? Is that where you?
Sure. Although if I could, Lee, let me just, I do spend a little bit of time in the book talking about John Quincy Adams, who of course was Jackson's nemesis. And the two men obviously did not like one another, to say the least. I kind of hold out John Quincy Adams, even though his presidency is frequently described as a failure, as an example of a president who, had some genuine sympathies for those minority groups, whether they were racial, political, economic, that were out of step with the Jacksonian majority. And, John Quincy Adams was defeated resoundingly in 1828. But there's a lot I think we can take from John Quincy Adams' presidency that sort of stand in stark contrast to what I see as a demagogic presidency of Andrew Jackson. And interestingly enough, one person who was impressed to some extent by John Quincy Adams was a young congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. And actually, Lincoln was part of the congressional team that planned the state funeral for John Quincy Adams in the 1840s. And so I spend a considerable amount of time talking, obviously, about President Lincoln, who clearly was of the people, by the people, for the people. But Lincoln, I think, shared that view that goes back to Hamilton and Washington and John Quincy Adams, that certain questions should not be subject to majority rule. And of course, for Lincoln, it was the expansion of slavery. And we were simply not going to allow, or should not allow, the new territories and the new states that were admitted to the Union to simply vote up or down on slavery. Certain questions, this regime, this American regime, stood for something, stood for those principles that had been enunciated in the Declaration of Independence, and they were off limits to a popular vote. So while Lincoln was of the people, he was not somebody who shared Andrew Jackson's belief that the majority is to govern at all times. Again, certain issues, certain basic civil rights and civil liberties were off limits to majority rule.
There's some examples over the Lincoln presidency of kind of perhaps how this view or the implementation of this view evolved.
Yeah, it's interesting. Lincoln is frequently criticized for either vacillating somewhat on the slavery issue, at least initially, as president. His position does seem to harden over time on the issue of not just halting the expansion of slavery, but abolishing it. And of course, he becomes one of the driving forces behind the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Again, Lincoln is clearly another one of these complex characters, but Lincoln understood, and he really, his political thinking, I think, was formed very much during the Jacksonian era. And he's horrified by what he sees during the Jackson Van Buren era. And what he sees is a lot of violence directed against abolitionists, directed against free blacks. There was a famous incident where an Illinois newspaper editor was killed by pro-slavery elements. I think his name was Elijah Lovejoy. Lincoln delivers a speech at the Young Men's Lyceum in 1838, where he's trying to warn Americans about this Jacksonian worship of public opinion and of majority rule, and to say that there are certain things that this regime stands for that, again, cannot be or should not be subject to a vote. And that is one of the most basic of those rights is the right to life and to liberty. So there definitely is an evolution over time in Lincoln's position. By the end of his presidency, clearly he has thrown the full weight of his office behind the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And I think we can say, and I do suggest in the book, that Lincoln is, in a sense, refounds the American regime, and to some extent refounds the American presidency.
Yeah, you noted that while Lincoln admired Jefferson, there was a substantial departure in his approach to the presidency. Yeah,
that's a terrific question, and it's one I had to wrestle with at length in the book, because Lincoln repeatedly praised Jefferson throughout his life, barely mentions Hamilton. Lincoln does, however, revere George Washington as well. And I've had to wrestle with this question of how could a man such as Lincoln, who once said, "All honor to Jefferson," the author of the founding principles of the Declaration, I'm loosely paraphrasing there, how could he have this intense worship, in a sense, of Jefferson, and yet his policies are closer to what we would call the Federalist tradition. He's a believer in internal improvements. He's a believer in a thing like a national bank. He's very much got a kind of Hamiltonian, Henry Clay American system, internal improvements. That's not Jefferson. I've come to the conclusion that part of Lincoln's embrace of Jefferson was to sort of take the most, or one of the most prominent Southern slave owners, who's a revered figure, particularly in the South, and to kind of use that language of Jefferson against the slaveocracy. And I think it was a brilliant political or tactical move. But I think if you really push Lincoln, if you really dig to the core of Lincoln, you find more of a Federalist, more of a Hamiltonian, more of a Henry Clay supporter than you certainly find any sort of Jefferson or Jacksonian elements.
Very interesting. So let's go forward from there. Now, Woodrow Wilson is someone who you have kind of seen as what, kind of refounding the presidency?
Yeah, and I just used that term with Lincoln, and I should have held off on that because there's much more of a radical change when by the time you get to Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. I mean, clearly Abraham Lincoln expanded the power of the presidency, certainly when it came to the use of emergency powers like suspending habeas corpus and blockading the South, etc. But Lincoln still, I think, had a deep appreciation for the founding and for the Constitution, always tried to link his actions to the Constitution. Wilson is pretty much upfront in saying, look, the Constitution did a nice job. It was written in the 18th century during horse and buggy times. We're now in a more complex century, the 20th century, the industrial world. Our system of government needs to change with the times. And, it's time to sort of get past our reverence for the Constitution and for the founders. And I think Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, to some extent, saw themselves as refounding the American regime, moving it even further down the road to sort of rooting the presidency in particular as a spokesman for the American people. Wilson flat out says that the president is free to be as big a man as he wishes to be, and the only limits on his power are what, the limits that he possesses, eventually she possesses.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a definite refounding of the presidency under Woodrow Wilson. I'm quite critical of Wilson in this book on a number of levels, both in terms of how he changed the presidency and also, unfortunately, his racial policies, which were, to be blunt, disgraceful.
Yeah, indeed. So you mentioned the 20th century, the industrial age, and so forth, right? The modern technologies blossoming forth and so forth. Wilson feeling like, for those reasons and others, the presidency needs to evolve in the way in which we approach this. Are there other examples of the way in which technology has changed and had an impact on the way men to this point have carried out the responsibility of the presidency, and how they've viewed that presidency?
Sure. Well, so Wilson has this vision of the president not only leading the public, but shaping their opinions, developing almost a personal relationship with the public. And of course, Franklin Roosevelt, who serves in the Wilson administration as an assistant secretary of the Navy, will take this new technological development of radio to form that intimate bond with the American public. In a way, it was a bond that only Wilson could only dream of. I mean, radio was starting to come on the scene, and we do have recordings of Woodrow Wilson, but it's FDR who really takes this new technology and uses it to enhance the power of the presidency and to enhance his personal bond with the American public. If you go to the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York, you will find letter after letter after letter from citizens writing the president, and they will say things like, I listened to your address the other night, and I felt like you were in the room with me. You were right across from me in my own living room. That's an incredible power that the founding fathers, for instance, couldn't have really dreamed of. But Wilson understood its potential, and certainly Franklin Roosevelt understood its potential and used it to the max. And then, of course, John F. Kennedy will take the new medium of television and become even more of an intimate figure with the American public. So there is this little bit of a sub-theme throughout the book of technological developments and how they've enhanced or fed into this notion of a popular or a populist presidency.
You know, it's interesting your note about Wilson, but then FDR taking advantage of radios. It's hard to imagine a letter coming into a Wilson administration, right? If the technology was a little further advanced. You know, I felt like, yes, the president of Princeton was here in the room with me, right? Just be, I think, a completely different sense.
Yeah.
FDR was certainly masterful.
That's right. That's right.
So let's go forward then to, you know, I mentioned at the outset, we'd probably go up to Eisenhower. Here was a man who had just helped save the world, in a sense, and had this opportunity to run for office, and obviously was elected. Talk to us about how he shaped the office. He certainly, when you're the Supreme Allied Commander, I imagine maybe a little bit of that goes through your head. How did he implement the presidency that was perhaps different than some of his predecessors?
Yeah, it's interesting. On one level, Eisenhower really didn't challenge the policy proposals that came out of the Wilson administration or out of the New Deal or even Truman's Fair Deal. There was no concerted effort to kind of roll back some of the social welfare programs that had been created by Eisenhower's Democratic predecessors. But on another level, Eisenhower did have a different conception of how he should conduct himself as an American president, and it was a more traditional vision. It was a vision of the president as a unifying figure. Now, maybe, as you said, Lee, maybe being the Supreme Allied Commander gave Eisenhower an advantage in that regard. This guy's a legitimate war hero and comes in as kind of a non-partisan figure. In fact, both political parties have been trying to recruit Eisenhower to run for president both in 48 and 52. But Eisenhower gave it some real thought. How was he going to conduct himself as president? And he played that head of state role, I think, to great effect. He tried to serve as a unifying figure. He generally kept quiet, and this is going to generate some criticism towards him, but he stayed out of the real heavy-duty partisan battles of the 50s and left that up to Vice President Nixon. But that conception of trying to stay above the fray, of acting as a unifying figure, of not stoking partisanship. I spend a considerable amount of time admiring Eisenhower's willingness to not play that game. Now, again, you could say, well, he had Nixon do that for him, and to some extent, that's true. But there was something, excuse me, in Eisenhower's character that resisted personal assaults. He really did not, and he would reprimand even Richard Nixon, who would occasionally engage in these kind of personal attacks. That was not Eisenhower's style. And the book tries to make the case that maybe that conception of the presidency is one that more American presidents should adopt. Staying above the partisan fray, acting as a unifying figure, and not feeding the, pardon the expression, the sort of public opinion beast, which, you know, depending on which day of the week you're talking about, that can shift, sometimes even hourly. So I think Ike's a good example of a president who serves as something of a role model for all American presidents.
You know, so I said we'd stop at Eisenhower, but you mentioned Kennedy earlier. He certainly was someone that captured the
Yeah.
nation's attention. His not only him but his family and so forth. Talk to us a little bit about how kind of the impact he had during a relatively short period of time, and then any lasting impact from there.
Sure. Yeah, John F. Kennedy was only president for 2 years, 10 months, and 2 days. And I know this because I just completed a manuscript on the Kennedy presidency. So
is that a future book?
I hope so, Lee. Yeah, I hope so. I'm about to start shopping it around, so we'll see. Growing up in Massachusetts, I grew up in a diehard New Deal, New Frontier family. My first job was at the John F. Kennedy Library in Boston when I graduated from college. So I've been kind of immersed in this Kennedy story all my life. But again, yeah, he was only president for less than 3 years, but it shows you the power of television. Kennedy understood that he had barely won the election of 1960, razor thin margin. Most of the newspapers in the country, believe it or not, the editorial pages had endorsed Nixon, even though I know there's an impression of the media being leaning Democratic. At least in 1960, that was not the case. So Kennedy wanted to go around the news media, wanted to go around some members of Congress who were obstructing his agenda, and he used television to great effect. And this was a new thing, these live televised press conferences. Eisenhower had had press conferences, but they were never live. They were always edited and then released to the media after the fact. Kennedy was confident enough to take these questions live on the air, and the public tuned in, and they liked what they saw. They saw a young guy who appeared to be healthy. He really wasn't that healthy, but he appeared to be young and vigorous. He was a smart guy. He was quick and quick-witted. And when he dies a short while later, again, that sense that the public knew him was intense. And having worked at the John F. Kennedy Library, I can tell you again, the same phenomenon, the letters that people would write the president after seeing a press conference or one of his occasional set speeches that might have been televised. They felt they knew this man. They felt they knew his family. And of course, the tragedy of dying at such a young age with his wife by his side. And then that 72-hour, the first time the networks had ever gone live, they followed the Kennedy assassination and funeral on a Friday through a Monday. This had never happened before. It really left its mark to the point where even to this day, at least among people of my generation, John F. Kennedy is repeatedly ranked as the greatest American president in the lifetimes of the baby boomers, and it's not even close. And it's primarily due to that bond that was created through television.
Fascinating. So we're going to stop there in terms of the presidency, but I want to make a couple notes, and then I think Carrie's going to join us with questions. So Stephen, the name of the book again?
It's called The Lost Soul of the American Presidency, The Decline into Demagoguery and the Prospects for Renewal. And
one of the things I want to mention to folks is that Stephen was kind enough to offer some signed books through the site that can be purchased at historycamp.org and historycamp.org/online, I should say. Carrie, what sort of questions have we had?
Well, Jenny in Washington, D.C. would like to know which president you think accomplished the most with the least in terms of resources, support, or maybe even personal skills or talents.
Wow, geez. Accomplished the most with the least? Well, I will say this, and this may come as a surprise to some folks. I have a few pages in there where I have some positive things to say about William Howard Taft. Poor William Howard Taft is, president between Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson. He only serves for one term. He's resoundingly defeated for re-election in 1912. But during that 4 years in office, his administration actually passes more antitrust legislation and more environmental conservation measures than Teddy Roosevelt, who usually gets all the credit for that. And I mentioned Taft because unlike Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, Taft does not play the sort of populist game that I've been talking about tonight. He's not somebody who believes the Constitution is outmoded. He's not somebody who plays the partisan card to the extent that TR and that Woodrow Wilson did. Now, look, in the end, he pays the price by losing fairly convincingly to both, to Woodrow Wilson, who wins the election, but TR does better than he does, than Taft does. So I would put William Howard Taft in my Hall of Fame of underrated presidents. And I even had the audacity to suggest in the book that maybe we need to rethink the presidents that we celebrate. And I said something to the effect of possibly changing Mount Rushmore and adding William Howard Taft, assuming he would fit, which was probably kind of a cheap shot, but Taft is my guy.
All right. Well, thank you. Fantastic. Well, Steve, this has been very interesting. And if you would like to purchase a copy of Steve's book that is signed and inscribed, you can do that on our website. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone. And next week, we will have historian and author Don Cygan here, and we'll be talking about the Battle of the Bulge and specifically Bastogne. So join us next week. And we are looking forward to an exciting event on August 1st called America's Summer Road Trip. And we hope you will join us. Stay tuned for more details on that. Have a good night.
Night, everybody.